My talk aims to connect two different areas in life science, which are ecodevo and cognitive science. So I will try to show some important links between them by promoting a meta-theoretical analysis. That is, by understanding their place in science and which kind of explanatory toolkits they involve. So particularly, I will argue that important aspects in the foundation of cognitive science can help to understand the challenge of plant ecodevo and other areas to neo-Darwinisms. So, well, I organize this talk in the following way. First, I will sketch core idea of plant ecodevo and the developmental term. Then I will present central ingredients of intentional explanation in cognitive science. And I will argue that all of these ingredients are present in plant ecodevo. So I will argue for the thesis that plants should be considered intentional systems. And finally, I will defend the same thesis, but in a different way. I will show that the recipe that cognitive science uses to overcome behaviorisms is the same recipe that plant ecodevo and other areas are using to overcoming neo-Darwinisms, and that's why I call cognitive revolution. So as we know, and it has been talking in this workshop, in the last 40 years, many areas remarked the crucial role of development in evolution. So we can enclose these areas on the level of developmental term, and they are principally ecodevo, evodevo, extended inheritance systems, developmental system theory, molecular epigenetic, niche construction, developmental psychobiology, organismal biology, and, well, many others, of course. So, although I'm aware that there are differences between them, all of them recognize the crucial role of developing organisms in biology. And in all cases, these areas represent a challenge to mainstream view of life. So, although I will be centered in plant ecodevo and taking the work of Sonia Sultan as a central guide, I will use the term developmental term to refer to this new focus on biology that certainly I don't know which is the proper term to use. So, well, what is the central idea of ecodevo? Well, probably we know by the talk of Sonia yesterday. And as she did it, a way to present ecodevo is in relation to what it denies. And this is a gene-centered view of development and other biological process. So as it is well known, the modern synthesis and the development of molecular biology allowed biologists to reduce variation, development, inheritance, and evolution to process at the level of genes and gene pools. So as most recognize and remark the modern synthesis, black boxes developing organisms. This means that developmental and organismal properties are not necessary to understand the diversity and aptness of living beings. So ecodevo and the developmental term propose a different picture. Sonia Sultan says that the main aim of plant ecodevo is to determine precisely how plants perceive and respond to the varying environmental conditions they encounter in their real life. That is, to understand development as an holistic, context-sensitive, and situated process mediated by perceptions and responses. So now I will briefly present some important theoretical ideas within the developmental term and ecodevo, and the first one is agentivity. So the developmental term, as is usually remarked, is devoted to open the box that modern synthesis biologists had closed. So its slogan is that developing organisms are explanatory necessary in biology. So global properties, context sensitiveness, timing, self-organization, symbiosis, niche construction, regulatory systems, and many other capacities and phenomena at the ontogenetic level are necessary to understand the causes of adaptive change and preservation. So a central point to see the role of agent in adaptive evolution is the challenge to explanatory externalism, something that Richard Lewontin stressed many times. So according to the modern synthesis, adaptation consists of the adjustment of traits to a pre-existent niche, and such adjustment is done by natural selection, by an external force evaluating phenotypic outcomes. So explanatory externalism is the thesis that the only force explaining fitness and aptness comes from the environment. But well, from an agentic viewpoint, the view is different because it's the organism itself responsible in dialogue with external and internal conditions to develop adaptively and to construct the niche it will fit in. So as a sort of proto definition, I can say that agentic causation consists primarily of two responses that the organism actively promotes to stay adaptive thanks to science and information processing. So agentivity lies in linear processing whose outputs are obtained thanks to the complexity, dynamism, and sensitivity of organisms. So well, signals and signaling systems are central in Ecodivo, as we know, and my reflection will turn around this place in signals in development. So, as we know, plant signals are based on physical, chemical, and electric interactions. They are cell-to-cell communication that construct wider signaling networks. And as Sultan says, once the environmental information is perceived, it is traduced into internal things, which components include pigments and other receptor molecules, hormones, steroids, and many other things. So plants are capable of perceiving different aspects of the world, such as changes in light and shadow, predators, temperature, food location. They have gravitation in their roots. There is plant-to-plant communication, and even they are capable of recognizing their offsprings. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. And well, in response to these perceptions, they can change the growth and form. They can develop roots oriented to more nutritive areas or toward other plants to exchange information. They can change the form and surface of leaves to overcome dangerous temperatures, or they respond to predators, for instance, by producing chemical signals that call the predator of the predator. This is amazing when I read it. So well, Sonia systematized the relation between signals and responses under the level of environmental cue and response systems. The idea is that the organism perceives aspect of its environment as a specific piece of information and then responds to that cue by expressing particular phenotypic effect, such as developmental, physiological, or behavioral adjustment. So now I can stress the crucial role of signaling systems in plants. Signals are the main ingredient to endow organisms' responses with an adaptive dimension. As Sultan says, perceiving a relevant environmental signal is the essential first step in any plastic response. So from this consideration, we can appreciate an epistemic meaning of niche construction. So before being a material process of construction concerning change in the organism-environment relationship by migration, choosing, invading, and other processes, there is first a step of epistemic construction. This notion of construction concerns how the organism represents its environment to respond to it, and this work is done by signaling systems. So I think that this is an epistemic reading of Lewontin's idea that the organism determines what is relevant for it. And I think that this epistemic notion is the main challenge to explanatory externalism. So to end this presentation of Plant Ecodivo, let's remark that that the role of signals is stressed, and this role is to produce sensitiveness. We can understand why they allow the organisms to develop adaptivity. The idea is that without signals, we will have, again, as in modern synthesis, a theory of phenotypic variation and development purely based on randomness and blindness. So I can sketch another proto-definition of what is an adaptively directed developmental process. So the development of a system X or an organism is adaptive directly if and only if the system X is sensitive to its inner and outer conditions thanks to signaling systems, and its activity is done according to the conditions informed by such signals. And so as I put there, the idea of done according to signals to stay adaptive is a primary approximation to intentionality in plants. So well, after this presentation, let's move to intentionality and how cognitive science understands it. As a primary approximation, I can take the definition of philosopher of mind and language John Searle. Intentionality is that property of many mental states and events by which they are directed at or about or objects and state of affairs in the world. So, as it can be appreciated, it is usually considered that intentionality is specific of minds. I will challenge this view by saying that intentional explanations are not exclusive of cognitive psychology. So I will not argue that plants are minded organisms, but just that they are explained by involving intentional explanation. So it's important to remark that plant intentionality does not necessarily require any kind of natural language or linguistic underpinnings. Neither there is any commitment with consciousness in plants. And more generally, I am still agnostic concerning plant cognition. So I will focus on the other part of the definition of Searle, that certain states of the organisms are directed or about process and object of the world. So with this remark in mind, let's present 4 crucial ingredients of intentional explanation in cognitive science. First, the idea that behavior is caused by complex informational process is central in the cognitive revolution. Such processes are mainly internal and devoted to integrate, modify, and connect and reduce units of information. And the second point is that representation are such units of information. So representation information were the building blocks of intentionality in the cognitive revolution. So importantly, representations are responsible first to explain how a system can have directness to the world, and secondly, how such directness can promote an adequate response, an intelligent response, an adaptive response. And these 2 capacities are obtained thanks to 2 intrinsic properties of representation, which are aboundness and normativity. Shortly, aboundness concerns the capacity of a representation of it about something else, of a stand for another things of the world. So representation have referential capacities. And if behavior is caused by representational processes, and such processes are about environments where the organism lies, then it is expected that behavior will have directness toward such environment. And finally, a core property of representation and intentional state is normativity. Representation pictures the world, the organisms in a certain way, which nonetheless could be eventually misguided. So the adequacy of behavior and environmental cue system response trace back to the verticality of representation and the functioning of the mechanisms of information processing. So well, these are central stuff in the philosophy of mind and language. And with these 4 ingredients, we can see that the directness of behavior, as cognitive science understands it, is directness toward what is happening now, toward environmental circumstances where the animal lives. So another proto-definition could be that intentional causation consists primarily of the behavior that the organisms actively promote to stay adapted thanks to representation and informational processing. Intentionality lies in inner processing whose outputs are obtained thanks to the complexity, dynamisms, and sensitiveness of the organisms. So to argue that plants are intentional systems, I will show that all the ingredients of plant intentionality are present in plant eco-devo. So information processing could be understood as the flowing of information through cell-to-cell signaling systems. So signals get into complex mechanisms to produce an adequate response, and such network of signaling systems constitute a channel from where information flows. So as cognitive scientists, eco-devo biologists also possess a unit of information, which are signals, and as well as behavior is the result of representational process, eco-devo's responses are caused by pathway of signaling systems at different levels of the organisms. And well, we can see the properties of aboundness and normative are also part of science and signaling systems, because aboundness of science is clear in the sensitiveness that plant achieve thanks to signaling systems. So again, the idea is that if signals wouldn't be about external filters of the organism's internal milieu, the responses of plant will not be adaptively directed by blended. So moreover, there is an intrinsic notion of normativity in the adaptive dimension of development. The reason is quite simple. Insofar as the organism is pursuing an adaptive scenario, there is a demarcation of what is adaptive and what is maladaptive for organisms. So to make adaptively directed development successful, both signals and the mechanisms of informational flowing should work properly. So the core properties of intentional explanation are also present in plant in vivo. Indeed, Sonia Sulta seems to accept the possibility to consider that in a broader framework, all type of environmentally mediated phenotypic expression can be viewed as cue and response system. So in other words, what I say is that intentional explanation are a mark of the living, of agents, and not exclusively of animals. So importantly, the directness in plants development is not about evolutionary histories, blueprinted in genes, or about adult end states. Development is constantly adaptively directed to its inner and outer conditions for life. So this directness of cognitive system is the same kind of directness that we see in plant development. It consists of inner and outer context-sensitive activity mediated by perceptual organs and informational mechanisms of transaction, processing, and response. So I can conclude for the thesis that plants are intentional systems, or another way to present that is to say that agential causation, as I previously defined it, is identical to intentional causation. In both cases, they consist in the flowing of information involving signs or representations, whose outputs are obtained thanks to the complexity, dynamisms, and sensitivity of the organisms. So, well, let's move to the last part. So now we can see some relationship between the foundation of cognitive science and the foundation of the developmental turn in biology. This is something that it was already explored by Ron Amundsen. And the first thing to know is that both cognitive science and the developmental turn are trying to open black boxes, and that indeed they are using the same key to do that. So it is usually said that behaviorism's black boxes the mind by just studying stimulus response dynamics, where behavior is studied just by seeing the inputs and the outputs, as if internal processing were explanatory relevant. And similarly, the modern synthesis black boxes development. So supposedly, according to the modern synthesis, one can study adaptive evolution without looking to developing organisms. So just by looking to genetic inputs and the fitness of phenotypic outcomes. And the point is that both cognitive science and developmental biology open their boxes by understanding inner processing based on environmental information. So what I want to stress is that opening boxes with informational and representational talk is the mark of a cognitive revolution. And I believe that this is what is happening in developmental biology. So let's end with some other reflections. We can see some consequence of these proposals if we look in some classical troubles in biology. For instance, if we think about teleology, we already remarked that the directness of developmental processes seems to involve a kind of teleological explanation, where there is something that organisms are pushing to develop adaptively. And as I argue, there is also a normative dimension which is intrinsic to the directness of development. So what I found interesting is that if we look into history, both intentionality and teleology have had a paradoxical situation in the foundation of life science. Both seem to be explanatory necessary, but yet both seem to be unexplained from a naturalist viewpoint. This famously gave rise to Brentano's problems concerning intentionality and Kant's puzzle regarding teleology. So the classical troubles in the history of biology and the science of behavior is to understand how we can integrate these concepts in a naturalistic framework, or how can we accept them according to the foundation of modern science. So the point, historical point, is that what was central in the cognitive revolution is that cognition could be part of science. And to do so, cognitive science introduced intentional explanation based on informational and representational ideas. So if intentionality could get into science by introducing informational talk and representation, maybe the same ticket can be used for teleology in development. That is, if we understand the teleological dimension of development in intentional terms, maybe the classical troubles surrounding teleology could be solved in the same way. So this is the final proto-definition, says that teleology consists of two activities caused by the agent as a consequence of its sensitiveness, reached by signaling or representational systems, and the flowing of information at different levels of the organism. So based on that, I can sketch another thesis or conjecture that says that teleological explanation as developmental biology take terms could be understood as intentional explanation on the grounds of cognitive science. So as an open questions, I have some questions for further research. So I say that I am agnostic concerning the extension of cognition to plants. So I believe that one needs further argument to say that plant intentionality also deserves psychological categories. So the basic point is that I'm still searching and looking and thinking for a criterion to say when a system is cognitive or mental or perceptual or intentional and when it is not. Another programmatic open question that I found super interesting concerns a possible unificationist role of informational theory. So what is interesting is that informational talk is central both in cognitive science and developmental biology, and that indeed different proposals promote the same kind of informational theory in each field, such as the account of Paul Griffith and Carol Stoll in developmental biology and some informational accounts in cognitive science. Another interesting question is whether biosemiotic and its relation with von Usch's work could operate as a bridge between ecodevo signaling system and representationalism. And finally, I'm aware that even though I adopt a representationalist talk, it has been many challenges around it, and mainly by biological informal proposals. So I still believe that representational talk is explanatory central, or a sort of minimal representation, as we talked in last talk. I think that we should try to find a midterm position between orthodox computationalisms and radical theories of situated cognitive science. So well, that's all. Many thanks for listening.